everybody. The Simple Handicap for Tuesday, October 1st. Thank you for making me a part of your morning. And thank you to each and every one of you who listened or downloaded an episode in the month of September and contributed to a record month for consumption of the podcast. 150,000 unique downloads on Apple and Spotify. Appreciate it very much. A lot of work goes into these daily podcasts, and I'm glad to see everybody is enjoying them as the show continues to grow month after month after month. YouTube continues to grow as well. I'm glad I'm starting to put up the daily videos. If you're enjoying these videos on YouTube, would love to hear about it in the comments, what you're enjoying from the shows, what you like about it. If you're able to share them with friends, if you're listening on audio or watching on video, I appreciate it very much. But that's a pretty special milestone to hit for a monthly download mark of the show, and it's one that I hope to continue to grow on, both on the audio and the video version of the podcast show. So thank you very much for everybody who has been listening so far this season. Before we get into the first market rundown of NFL Week number 5, just some quick thoughts from Monday Night Football. As always, I had the post-game live reaction published on YouTube. If you're listening on audio format this morning, you can head over to the RAS Picks YouTube channel, listen to the reaction video. If you're already here on the channel this morning, you can go down into the video feed below and you can watch that to get a little bit more in-depth thoughts from Seattle and Detroit. Talked about the game for about 10 minutes. So I think for Seattle, you have to feel a little bit unfortunate. They have 38 first downs. It is a record high number of first downs for a losing team in the modern NFL era. They were moving the football at will. And that is what Seattle with Geno Smith does against defenses that play a ton of man coverage. He was getting the ball out quick. He was on target. The pressure, as it hasn't all season, did not bother him again, despite it being in his face almost every single drop back. Hutchinson caused so much trouble. He was able to navigate around that. And these wide receivers are just deadly. The mesh concepts that were being run and called by Ryan Grubb early were awesome. It forced Detroit into changing up their personnel on defense. I mean, that was a very well-called game. Less 2 goal line fades that were thrown by Ryan Grubb in a tough spot. Really the first big step-up game of his young career as an offensive play caller in the NFL. So you see Seattle, they give up 42, but in a loss like that, it's hard to say they looked the part, but I mean, I left that game thinking they looked the part. And I'm watching, and I'm like, again, we have Detroit -4 to go perfect for the week. I'm texting, I'm in the group chat, and I'm a little panicked. I'm like, the Lions are not going to be able to stop the Seahawks at this rate. Like, this looks so good for Seattle. And really, it was the refs and that OPI on Lockett, which really wasn't an OPI, that ended up being the difference. So that was the takeaway there. Obviously, you have to give Goff credit. I'm not trying to take away. He was perfect on the night, 25% above expectation, a 98th percentile game from an EPA per plays perspective, plus 0.73 EPA per play. I mean, amazing game from Goff, as good as you're ever going to see. But the Lions were barely on the field. They ran 47 plays before the garbage time end of game scenario. They went run heavy again, which was the right thing to do against the Seattle defensive front that was dealing with a ton of injuries. And this is now 3 weeks in a row from Ben Johnson that we've seen the Lions directly attack the weakness or injured part of an opposing defense. And he's going after the weakness, and he's exploiting it. And the Lions offense looked great. I think the bye is going to help them settle things down on defense a little bit, becoming a little bit predictable. They're really kind of sitting in coverages. It's like the inverse of Gus Bradley in Indy, but with man. Can say Ryan Nielsen in Jacksonville similar, but it's aggressive, boy. But it is fairly predictable, and we saw Seattle put up more than 500 yards of offense on them. So good and bad there, but I thought Seattle certainly looked the part, and Detroit, again, dominant. Tennessee, Miami, honestly, I didn't watch a whole lot. I watched the Will Levis injury and him going down. I thought Mason Rudolph underwhelmed. I have no idea what to think about the Dolphins offense at this point with Huntley in. It didn't look any different. The run game was still ineffective. The offensive line was still semi-non-functional. And the Titans were down a key defensive starter in Simmons, who's been elite against the run. The Dolphins still couldn't run the football. I don't know what to think about what's going on in Miami, and I wonder what we're going to get at quarterback from Tennessee going forward. It was a 31-point output that really doesn't read like 31. But yeah, those are two tricky teams that I don't really have a good take on. And so I'm not going to spend too much time on that this morning and try to figure out later today what in the world we're getting out of Tennessee and Miami. Let's get to the Week 5 market rundown, second of the week after the Sunday evening show. It starts off Thursday Night Football, Tampa Bay on the road at the Atlanta Falcons. This was as high as Atlanta -3. Yesterday, Atlanta was sitting 2.5. Midday, numbers taken out. 2.5's gone. 2's gone. We're looking at 1 or 1.5 left to right across the screen this morning. Total 43.5. Touched 44. Came back. Mike Evans hits the injury report. Looks very much like a veteran rest day to me. I'm not reading too much into that. We'll see later today. It is a short week for Tampa Bay. Looking at Troy Anderson in the middle as the linebacker for Atlanta. I haven't seen a confirmed status yet. It was a little bit busy in the evening yesterday night, so getting here to the podcast this morning. Don't have a clear take on what we're getting from Anderson other than he was an absolute menace in the game last week against the Saints. 17 tackles. They need him out there. Don't know what his status is going to be. If he's not, that certainly opens up opportunities for Tampa Bay on the ground, which will absolutely balance out that offense in a pretty big way. No real strong take on this side or total at the moment. It is a first-time Thursday Night Football for the new staff in Atlanta. Now, I don't know where you put Raheem Morris in that, considering it's a round 2 for him, but it is new for the coordinator on both sides. And so new team, young staff, Thursday night, first short week. Did they fit that mold or not? It's borderline with this one. Let's see if that angle takes off. It is another divisional game. We've seen 3 Thursday Night Football divisional matchups so far. They have all trended under, and they've all been pretty ugly as well. So is this one going to fit the same mold? We will see. Jets on the road in London, as are the Vikings, playing at Hotspur Stadium. There is wind in the forecast. It is a domed roof, but the roof does not close. So you have effectively kind of like a donut sitting on top of the stadium that overhangs in the middle. You have this open portion over where the field is. Wind typically, based on games that have been played here in the past, does not filter into the stadium at the same rate that it is blowing on top. So what that is likely going to leave this with is a tricky wind forecast to navigate. If there is rain, that gets a little bit interesting. Comments about the stadium last year was that it felt like playing on cement. That should make the Jets feel right at home when you think about how rock-hard MetLife looks. I mean, Thursday Night Football, I was looking at Cowboys uniforms. Everyone had bloody knees and elbows, so we'll see. But the weather forecast is kind of quirky for this one. Aaron Rodgers hit the injury report with an ankle injury. I don't get that is something that is going to keep him out. There was substantial under money that came in on this game. An interesting matchup to consider, and one we'll dive into pretty aggressively on Wednesday. So the Denver Broncos so far this season have blitzed at the number 1 rate in football. The New York Jets operate extremely slowly and run the play clock down almost every offensive snap. There was bickering back and forth between Rodgers and Salah about the cadence and the tempo of the game and the offense post-game. The blitz that Denver ran at nearly a 50% rate was able to time the snap of the Jets offense really well. The Jets didn't change out of that, and Rodgers was a bit of a sitting duck in the pocket because of it. When you think about that matchup and you apply it to Brian Flores, he's blitzing more than 40% of the time. It's the second highest in the NFL. So now the question becomes, the Jets just saw what effectively the Vikings are from a blitz and aggression percentage last week against the Denver Broncos, and they failed mightily against it. Do you trust the Jets to change the operation enough against the Vikings to not be bit by it for a second week in a row? To me, that's kind of the key handicap in this game that you're going to have to watch, because it's really something that Green Bay negated when they went up-tempo and moved the football well on Minnesota. So it's interesting. Now, number-wise, Jets were 2.5-point favorites on the look-ahead in the early market. We're now Minnesota minus 2.5 on the other side. This touched 3 a couple places yesterday morning. Didn't last. It's a neutral field game. That's a big adjustment for a neutral field The fact that this did not push through the 3, I think is pretty telling for what we're going to sit at the rest of the week. Carolina on the road at the Chicago Bears. Chicago, a 3.5-point favorite at Chris, 4 at Circa. Everywhere else across the market is pretty split on 3.5 or 4. No real decisive side here. It tipped a little bit towards 4 earlier yesterday. There was some buyback. We have to talk about the Panthers' defense in this scenario because Shai Tuttle, the nose tackle, you never underestimate the value of a strong nose tackle, is unclear for this game. They just announced yesterday that they lost Shaq Thompson for an extended period of time, who is their middle linebacker. They also lost Josie Jewell for this game. So all of the sudden, this Panthers defense is, loaded with injuries. You lose Derek Brown a few weeks ago. You are going through games now without your key nose tackle. You lose your 2 middle linebackers who were key against the run, which was a weakness of the unit to begin with. Outside of Xavier Woods and J.C. Horn, the projected defensive starters coming into the year that were viewed as trustworthy kind of cornerstone pieces, everyone else is gone. DJ Wanham is still not there. This team is just riddled with defensive injuries. Everything I've heard about Chicago from reporters, people around the team, is that the offense is improving. It was the best that it's looked against the Rams. We talked about how bad the Rams defense is. You would think Chicago is going to move the football in this game with all these defensive injuries piling up for Carolina. And so this, to me, is a pretty big adjustment in favor of Carolina from preseason numbers. It's almost like they're riding the high of that Raiders win into this spot, and it's like a question of, do you trust the Bears to cover margin at home with an offense that's viewed as being pretty erratic that I don't know if I necessarily agree with. And so an interesting number, an interesting total that's sitting currently at 42 as the Panthers look very much like an over team in this spot, but a very good Bears defense on the other side. Baltimore on the road at the Cincinnati Bengals. Ravens blow out the Buffalo Bills. They go from 1.5 to 2.5. Total 47. Woof. All the way up to 51. It's a big move on the total, and we haven't seen a lot of totals get bet up through the 50s. That is just a reflection of this matchup and how bad that Cincinnati Bengals defense really, really looks. Now, I will say the Ravens matchup against the Bills was kind of a one-of-one unique scenario. That is not what the Ravens are going to look like on a weekly basis, and that is a Bills team with a ton of injuries on the spine of that defense that just matches up horribly with the Baltimore Ravens offense. We chatted about it on the preview pod, and it's like this is a slam dunk matchup for the Baltimore Ravens, and they just exploited it. Now, it looks like Trey Hendrickson is going to be back for the Bengals and not going to miss time. That is important. However, when you think about what the Ravens are doing well on offense right now, it is running the ball from heavy personnel and attacking the middle of the field. The Bengals need to have Rankins and Hill on the defensive line to have a chance because they have not been able to show any resistance against the run game at all this entire season. If those two guys are out, the Ravens have, again, a very clear out. So you have to watch those 2 injuries as the week progresses, as that is going to be key to this game. Buffalo on the road at the Houston Texans. A release yesterday from a service on the Houston Texans pushes this one out to as high as -1, -115 at Chris. Split between -1 and Pick'em across the board. So it's Buffalo -1 on the look ahead. You get a slight adjustment on the reopen, and then it's pushed up. Houston just sneaks by the Jacksonville Jags late in the game in the fourth quarter with a touchdown to win. As we mentioned, the Bills get blown out. We don't see much of a change. I think it's a hard spot to downgrade the Bills for how bad that matchup was for them against Baltimore. Indianapolis on the road at the Jacksonville Jags. Jags still 2.5-point favorites. Total in this game is 46. As I'm looking at this one, it's really hard to decipher what you're getting out of Jacksonville. Some really odd press conferences from Doug Peterson, who's bailing out Press Taylor. He's throwing his players under the bus. I don't know what you get from that. Now, injury-wise for the Colts, Anthony Richardson, unclear if he's going to play. Sounds like a legitimate 50-50. We have Jonathan Taylor, unclear if he is going to play. High ankle injury. If you're basing it on what he says, it sounds optimistic that he is going to play. If you're looking at just past injuries. 2 running backs. Joe Mixon thought he was going to play, had a high ankle injury. He didn't end up playing. It's typically an injury that causes running backs to miss at least a game, but Taylor's kind of downplaying it. If you take away Richardson, you take away Taylor, you still have all of these defensive injuries. If that's the case for Indy, this is not closing below 3. If you get those guys back, or at least one of the 2 on offense, and maybe you get a surprise on defense with 1 or 2 returners, okay, I get it at 2.5. This is a game, although it might be tough to back Jacksonville, if you have those injuries stick for the Colts, I can't see this closing below 3. Miami, New England still off of the board. I have some thoughts on this game. I can't get into it now because we don't have numbers. Tomorrow's podcast, I'll definitely share some opinions on this one. Interesting to see what we get from this price. Cleveland, Washington. Commanders 3.5-point favorites, -105 at Chris. 3 -20 at Circa. 44.5 is the total. Left to right across the screen. The total's been bet up 2 points. Point spread at 3.5 got released by a pro bettor. Took out the numbers. It got down to 3. There was resistance. Commanders got bought back at 3. Pushed this back up to 3.5. When it got to 3.5 -10, there was more money that came in on Cleveland. In terms of weekly regression spots, which is a way that I love to handicap the NFL, a way that's very successful to handicap the NFL, this is like the spot. Now, the question becomes, when you're thinking about the Browns offense, which has been incredibly ineffective with all of these offensive line injuries, we hear that Conklin and Willis' status will be updated later in this week. That's not a ringing sign of endorsement. David Njoku is going to be back at practice later this week. Chance for him to go. Nick Chubb returns, but he is not going to play in this game. Perhaps a bit of a leadership motivational boost having him involved in practice more. If you have a scenario for Cleveland where Conklin is in, Willis is in, and you get Njoku back, there's no way to me that Washington can be a 3.5-point favorite. However, I think that all 3 of those guys coming back and playing this week for Cleveland is probably in the 30% range that you get all of them back. Njoku's the very most likely to return. I think he's north of 50%. And with the tackles, you have much lesser chance of both of those guys being out there. So the question becomes, what do you get from this Browns offense against a very bad Washington defense, albeit because this is a game trying to justify a very big leap and a very big improvement in pricing for Washington, and whether or not it's being justified. Is the performance of Jaden Daniels as a rookie and the variance that comes with that justified to be upgraded this much? Has it gone too far? Something that's going to be referenced a lot, something that I certainly look at and would definitely lean that way, but it's really a Browns team that, I went back and looked at preseason roster ratings before week 1. The Browns were 5th. The Commanders were 27th. This game is now being priced like the Browns are down to 22, 23, and the Commanders are up to 14 or 15. I mean, it is a massive shift in terms of where these two teams are. And then you have to decipher through the schedule. Washington's played a cakewalk of teams, especially on the defensive side the last 3 weeks, but they've performed at a ridiculous level. You can't control who you play, but you can control how you play, and Washington has played exceptionally well. Now, they've just got by in 2 of those 3 games. Now they face a very, on paper, difficult Browns defense that, albeit just lost on the road in Las Vegas. So it is just a true spot to handicap that is going to be mentioned a ton this week. A fun one to talk about, and one I'm very curious to see if more Washington money enters the market on. Las Vegas on the road at Denver. Broncos 2.5s turned into 3 yesterday. Some bets come in, push the number up, 38, now down as low as 36.5 on the total. Arizona on the road at the San Francisco 49ers. Niners got as high as 7.5. A little bit of buyback on Arizona. Still waiting to see the status of Trey McBride. Still waiting to see what is going on the right side of the offensive line for Arizona as well. 2 key areas to monitor when it comes to injuries for the Cardinals. Rams hosting the Green Bay Packers. Packers 3.5-point road favorites. Total from 44.5 on the look ahead all the way up to 48 and shaded over as over money comes in. The last time we saw the Packers on turf, went absolutely wild against the Dallas Cowboys with all that speed they have at wide receiver. Will be without Christian Watson in this game as he's dealing with the ankle injury that is going to keep him out for at least a couple of weeks by all reports. But it is certainly the Packers with Jordan Love going from facing that aggressive Flores defense to getting one of the worst in the NFL on turf here with the LA Rams. Giants, Seattle, still off of the board. Sure is a long trip for New York to go across the country, isn't it? I know a lot of folks listening will get the joke when you're looking at that one. We'll pull the measuring tape out for this, or maybe we'll go to the good old MapQuest and figure out what we're looking at for mileage in this game from, I don't know, did they leave from JFK, getting all the way over to SeaTac. No number on this one yet. Looking like Seattle was going to be nearly a touchdown favorite, slightly less. Most likely when we get to reopen a little bit later this morning. Dallas on the road at the Pittsburgh Steelers. No Lawrence, no Parsons for this game, among other injuries for the Dallas Cowboys. Pittsburgh, a 2.5-point favorite, was 1.5, turned into 2. 2 turned into 2.5. We have yet to see a 3 anywhere on the board. If we do see a 3 on the board, I would be surprised if that is going to hold up, even with the defensive injuries for the Dallas Cowboys. Total from 42.5 now touching 43. And then it is Monday Night Football. The back and forth on the side. Yesterday morning, about 8:15 a.m. Pacific, one of the biggest betting groups releases Kansas City slightly earlier than normal, about 5 to 10 minutes earlier. We always release at 8:30. We've been loving the Chiefs. Perhaps there was some anticipation. We go back and forth on it. We see the release from the Chiefs. We go, okay, that's out of the question. About 20 minutes later, another service comes back, releases the Saints. So what was sent out, KC -5, turned into Saints 6, 6.5. The 6 is released. It pushes it back to 5. We're now locked in here, Kansas City. 5 left to right across the screen, total from 46 down to 43.5. When we're looking at injuries, really everything for the Kansas City Chiefs has been settled. We know the status of Rashee Rice. It's going to be a long-term injury. Not much of a factor when you're looking at this game, but I am curious for the Saints offensive line. What are we looking at center? What are we looking at right guard? That offensive line matched up last week became a bit of an issue in terms of what the Saints were trying to do, and it is a big night and day difference for them facing that Falcons front compared to going on the road into Arrowhead to face this Chiefs defensive front, which is now the unit that is controlling and running the team with the offense effectively back to what they were this time last season, trying to figure things out. So have to watch those Saints O-line injuries, and now we have conflicting release points on this game. An interesting one to continue to talk about throughout the rest of the week. I wish I had a little bit more conviction early in the week. Last week, I mean, everything was just right there. As here's the spot, here's the spot, here's the spot. You guys listen and know enough. There are these weeks that set up for me during the season that just fit what I do and what I like to look at and how I handicap. And last week was one of them, and we cashed in to the fullest extent. This week, a lot less of that. And so conviction's a little bit lower, a little bit of back and forth, a little bit of waiting to see how things shape up and what we're looking at. And this will be something that continues to be looked at as we go throughout the week. But hopefully some spots do open up and we can get a little bit more conviction on some of these. Potential first release of the week over at raspicks.com coming this morning at 8:30 a.m. Pacific. The price for the service has been prorated down to $4.95 for the remainder of the season. So if you want to follow along with all the remaining releases for the rest of the season, you can head over to the website to do that. We'll have an update again later this morning. Appreciate everybody for stopping by this morning and continuing to listen to and support the podcast. If you're on Apple or Spotify and you have a second to leave a rating before you go, would appreciate it very much. If you're listening on YouTube and you have a chance to subscribe, if you haven't already, or leave a thumbs up before you go, would appreciate that very much. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your Tuesday. We'll chat to you tomorrow morning.